Hi, welcome to Room to Grieve podcast. We're your hosts, Karen and Beck. Grab yourself a cuppa, find a comfortable spot, and we'll journey through grief together.
Hi. You okay?
Hi.
You feeling any better?
No. Feel all like tense, like I've gone for a job interview.
Right, well, just let's hear all about Brad. Let's just do your story. Get through it. It's over and done with. You're gonna cry. I'm gonna cry. Just do it. Do it from the heart.
I think my biggest thing for me is, as I said before, I've never told his story from start to finish. And there was a lot about his journey for us where we were let down by other people, and it's really hard for me to tell his story and focus on him and not that. And that's, something that I really struggle with, and I want to focus on him.
Yeah.
And then I get really cross with myself because I don't. I'm just going to try and tell his story so people understand quite what we all went through, really,
Okay.
and why we're here. I think I'm going to start from when COVID started, because as much as that's not when Bradley was diagnosed with cancer, for us, that's when this journey for us started, with Bradley being poorly and us having our trips in and out of the hospital. He, during COVID, just started losing a lot of energy and becoming very pale and exhausted, and his weight plummeted to under 7 stone, and he was 6'1", so that was quite a lot for him to sort of lose that much weight. And then after lots of tests in and out of hospital, it turned out that he had quite severe Crohn's, which is an autoimmune disease that affects the intestinal tract, really. And his was in his tummy and his intestines. And they tried lots of different treatments for him, diet plans and all the rest of it, but nothing was working. So sort of fast forward to April 22, and we'd spent a year and a half trying to treat his Crohn's and hadn't found anything. And they decided to start him on immunotherapy. The immunotherapy was by ways of injection once every 6 weeks that he would administer himself. And I vividly remember sitting in that nurse's office when they said to him, do you want to try the immunotherapy? And when he had to sign the forms, and them saying to him, there is a 1% chance that this could cause cancer. Now, my memory serves me that they said brain cancer, but I don't know whether I just remember it that way. I just remember Bradley saying, yeah, that's fine. Everything, what doesn't come without a risk of cancer? And the nurse kind of said the same thing, and so did I, and we all just shrugged it off as, okay, that's fine. So we signed. He had the first 2 injections. He seemed to get loads better. They were working. He was absolutely brilliant. He was got energy back. He was back riding his bike, going to the gym. He was doing his driving lessons. He booked his driving test. He was learning to do boxing, and he was happy. And he was so excited that he got his life back. And everything for us really started to fall down on the 14th of June 2022. That was a Tuesday. But on the Sunday before, I think was probably one of the best days we have ever had with Bradley. He was so happy, and he was bouncing around the house, and we sat and we had a barbecue in the back garden. And I remember sitting there on that day thinking, this is what happiness is. And I remember thinking, I need to film this because I just want to remember this forever. And at the same time, I thought, don't be stupid. This isn't a time for your phone. Live in the moment. So I didn't go and look for my phone, and I didn't film it. And that's a huge regret that I have. But then fast forward to the Tuesday morning, and it was about 3:00 in the morning, and Bradley woke up with a really bad headache, and he called his dad to come into his room and said that he'd Googled it, and Google had told him he'd got high blood pressure or a migraine, and could we do anything to help him? So his dad got him some tablets and a wet flannel and sat with him for a bit, and Bradley fell asleep. About 6 o'clock that morning, his dad went to work and Bradley's door was shut. And while Bradley had been ill with the Crohn's, it had become sort of a universal sign between us, as him and us as his parents, that if he was okay, he would shut his bedroom door and we didn't need to disturb him. And if he was ill, he'd leave his bedroom door open and we knew that he wanted us to go in and help him. So when Simon went to work at 6 o'clock, his door was shut. When I got up and got ready for work and started work around 8 o'clock, his bedroom door was shut. I was working from home, so I was working on my laptop downstairs, and my mobile rang, and it was Bradley. So I answered it and was just like, "You all right, mate?" And he could hardly talk. His speech was so slurred, and I could just try and make out that he was telling me that he had a really bad headache and that could I get him some tablets. So I ran quickly and got him some tablets and a glass of water and ran upstairs. And he was sitting in his bed, bolt upright, really stoic. And he wasn't moving. He was just fixated. He'd put sunglasses on and he just sat completely still. He said that the light was hurting his eyes and he'd got a really bad head. I couldn't really understand what he was saying. It was like he was drunk. His speech was really, really slurry. Now, I'm somebody who is quite dramatic in nature, so I was really panicking and thinking, oh shit, something's really wrong. I genuinely thought he'd had a stroke. I thought, I'm not going to be dramatic. I'm not going to call an ambulance. I'm going to call the doctor's surgery and I'm going to get an appointment, because then they'll tell me that I'm being dramatic and it will all be okay. So I dialed the doctor's surgery and I listened to that whole message that said, if this is a life-threatening emergency, please hang up, dial 999. And in my mind, I was thinking that's really what I need to do. But I didn't. I held on for the receptionist. The receptionist told me there was no appointments and to call 111. So I called 111 and they told me that they felt that he needed an ambulance. And I was like, okay, that's what they want. That's what we'll go with. His brother wasn't on shift to work that day, so he was at home, so I'd gone to fetch his brother. And I asked his brother if he felt that it was really bad. And seeing how Zachary sat there stroking Bradley, and he just nodded at me. And I thought, yeah, this is really bad. And Zachary rang his dad, and his dad was making his way home from work. And for about 40 minutes, we waited on hold to 111 for them to find an ambulance. And eventually they said that one had been dispatched. And a community first responder turned up. And she walked in and she said, "Oh, I think you've got a migraine, Bradley. Have you been gaming all night?" And he was like, yeah. He still wasn't able, he still hadn't moved. He still was sitting in exactly the same position and hadn't moved a muscle. And she was like, "Yeah, I think you've got a migraine." And I thought, okay, that's fine. Phew. She's a professional and she's telling me it's a migraine. So I was happy with that. Then the ambulance turned up and they agreed. They thought it was a migraine. But they said that because he was on immunotherapy treatment, we had to take him into hospital just in case he'd picked up an infection, because his immune levels would have dropped and, he was at risk of infection. So they said, because obviously he was also over 6 foot, he was a big lad, that bringing the wheelchair thing up here to take him down to the ambulance wouldn't have been easy. So could he walk? And Bradley was unable to stand up. So they asked him to crawl down the stairs. And by the time he got to the front door, I said to them, "Please, can you help him?" And so they put him on a stretcher and put him into the ambulance. And when we got in the ambulance, they gave him this shot of morphine and said to him that would help the pain. And they just said to him, just as a precaution, "Can you just put both arms above your head and smile for me and see if everything works?" And everything worked fine. So we all felt happy at that. We got less than 3 miles down the road in the ambulance, and his dad was following on in the car behind. And Bradley said to me, "Mum, I can't feel my hand." I said, "What do you mean, mate?" He said, "I can't feel it." And we got less than 200 yards past there, and he said, "I can't feel my arm, Mum." And I was really struggling to understand what he said. So the paramedic said to him, "Can you lift your arms, mate?" And only one arm went up. And the paramedic moved his mask and said, "Can you smile?" And only one side of his face smiled. So I went back to internalite, panicking, but couldn't let Bradley see. So we get to the hospital and they check him in as query migraine. The paramedic never said anything to the receptionist when they checked him in about the loss of use of his hands or anything. So then I thought again, okay, that's just me over dramatising everything again. He'd been checked into the paediatric A&E and they just put him in a wheelchair and just left him in the waiting room with a room full of people and just left us there. And then Bradley said he needed a wee, but his legs weren't working by this point, and I was really struggling to understand what he was saying. Like, it was almost incomprehensible. So the nurse walked past me and I stopped her and said, "Can you help me, please?" So she took him to the toilet and I said to her, "He's really struggling." And she said, "Yes, I have noticed. I've asked somebody to put him in a bay." So then a nurse comes along and puts him into a bay, and she says to him, "Got a migraine, have we? Have you never had one before? They can be a little bit bad, can't they?" And she was really standoffish and quite brash and rude. And I was a bit pissed off by her response, really, and her mannerisms. So as she went to leave, I said to her, "What are you going to do about the fact that his arm doesn't move?" And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, ask him to put his arms up." So he did, and they didn't move. And I said to her, "Ask him to smile." She said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "Well, his face doesn't work." So she pulled his mask down and she asked him to smile, and his face only worked on one side. And she turned to Simon and I, because Simon had managed to get past the Gestapo receptionist at this point and was able to come in the bay. And she said, "I don't want you to panic." And she hit this panic button and all hell just broke loose. And there must have been what felt like 20 people just came running. And there was sirens going off, and it kept saying paediatric emergency or paediatric resus or something. And then they started wheeling Bradley down a corridor, and they were shouting at me over and over again to tell them what happened. And they kept saying that I had to remember exact times. It couldn't be guesses. It had to be exact. And I had to tell them exactly what had happened because time mattered and it was so important. And my brain just went blank. And I just couldn't remember anything. And they took Bradley in for a CT scan and said that they were concerned that he'd had a stroke or DVT, because it's quite common in kids his age because they sit gaming a lot, which I hadn't even given that a thought. They did the scan and it was all relatively quick, to be honest. And then he came out and they took us to a bay that was right next to the nurse's station. And they said to us, "It's not a stroke, it's not DVT." So we felt, really quite happy at this point, because we'd never even dreamt it could be anything any worse. For me, that was worst case scenario. So that we didn't have a signal. So I'd gone outside to ring my dad and tell my dad that it wasn't a stroke. And I'd literally not got past the hellos pretty much with my dad. Simon came running back outside and told me I had to come back in. So I go back in and Bradley is still just sitting there and he hasn't moved a muscle. He's unable to stand by this point. He's so dizzy that he's been sick. He's can't talk at all. He's really struggling to swallow. And he's just in so much pain that he can hardly move. And he's just frozen, almost just staring. And they said to us that he needed to be transferred to our local hospital, Addenbrooke's in Cambridge, because that is a neuro-specialist hospital, and that they're going to send an ambulance to send him on lights and sirens, because he needs to go as a priority, as an emergency. And so that we needed to wait for that and go there. And then they said something about they'd found a lesion in his brain. And I asked them what they meant by a lesion. And he just turned round and just looked at me almost as though to say, "Are you a bit thick?" And he was just like, "A tumour." Simon let out this noise, this scream, and just ran. And I just stood there. And I just looked at Bradley and he just had this little tear that just came on his face. And I just thought, fuck, what do I do now? And then they all left. The doctors all just left us. A couple of hours later, we got asked to go into that dreaded little room where there's just 3 chairs and a little table and a box of tissues, so you know that nothing's good is ever going to come of that. And they said to us, please try and get some rest while you wait for the ambulance and prepare yourself for the worst 3 days of your life. I've no idea why 3 days, but that's just what they said. And then they left us, just to sit there, wondering, worrying. An ambulance finally turned up in the early hours of the morning, about 1-2 o'clock in the morning, and they had instructions to blue light Bradley to the next hospital. Even that didn't go without troubles. I mean, just the story of our life. 93 miles an hour in the fast lane of the motorway, the ambulance gets a blowout. So we have to call the bloody police to form a rolling roadblock, wheel Bradley out the back of one ambulance in the fast lane of the motorway and into another ambulance, and then carry on down the motorway to the hospital. I mean, only us, right? Just couldn't write it. So we finally get to Adam Brooks, and Bradley is taken to an adults ward and put in a little room at the end of the corridor. And we're just left there, really. Nobody says anything. And I just remember saying to one nurse as she sort of settled Bradley and said, but he was so happy. He was so happy. And she said to me, well, at least he had that, right? And I remember thinking, what do you mean? Like, I just don't get it. Bradley finally fell asleep about 4 o'clock in the morning, so I went looking for a nurse or somebody just to tell me what was going on, because we'd been told nothing and we just didn't really know what was happening, and I couldn't find anybody. I went back to sit with Bradley and I realised that I had a signal here, so I googled, and no matter what order I put those words into Google, it told me he was going to die. And I kept typing it again and again and again, just thinking that it would come up with something different. And it didn't. So then I went back out into the corridor to find somebody again. And I found a healthcare assistant. And I sat with her and cried for about an hour. And I just asked her over and over again, how am I supposed to go in there and tell my little boy that he's going to die? How am I supposed to leave here without him? I just didn't know what to do. So in that moment, I vowed that I would not leave the hospital without him. And we still didn't really know what was going on. We still didn't really know what was happening. We still really hadn't seen anybody. It was about 2 days later that they came and said that they were going to take him for an MRI scan. So they took him for an MRI scan, and we had to wait another 24 hours for the results. And a consultant came into Bradley's room and sat us all down together and said that Bradley had a really large tumour in his brainstem and that it was inoperable due to the location, because if you operate on the brainstem and you damage the brainstem, then you're instantly brain dead, so there's nothing you can do. Then he asked Simon and I to go outside into the corridor, and he said that he didn't want to tell us in front of Bradley, but Bradley had about 6 weeks to live, and there was nothing they could do. They asked us if we had any questions, of which I had a million but didn't ask any because my brain just stopped working. And then that was it, really. We went back into Bradley's room. He asked us when he was going to play football again and when he was going to drive his car again. His driving test was booked for the following week. And he asked if he was going to be well enough for his driving test. And we just said, don't know, mate. Didn't really know what else to say to him, to be honest. So then, over the next few days, they'd started him on steroids, and the steroids were really taking effect. And he learnt to swallow, and his speech came back, and he was able to start moving a little bit more. So he was able to start eating again. His face sort of wasn't as bad as it was before, and he was in great spirits, to be honest. He was quite happy, and we had some really nice moments, I would say. And it sounds really wrong to say that, but we had some really fun bonding times in that room, just me and his dad and him, and that feels weird, but it was nice. And I think Bradley didn't really understand the severity of it at all, and we hid it from him and we didn't really tell him. And then, really unexpectedly, on the Saturday, his consultant came into his room in his Saturday clothes and said that he'd been thinking a lot about Bradley and that he really liked Bradley as a kid and he wanted to do everything he could to help him. And as much as the hospital had said that they wouldn't operate on Bradley, he had rang round a few friends in the field and got some people from some other hospitals to come into the hospital to attempt the operation if that's what Bradley wanted. Now, the operation wouldn't be a cure-all, but it would enable them to do a biopsy so we could figure out exactly what we were facing and to hopefully debulk and remove some of the tumour. He explained it very much that it was a craniotomy like Lego. He said that they would cut into his head, sort of just above his ear, on his forehead, and they would lift his head, remove the top of his scalp, operate on the brain, and then bolt it back down like Lego with screws. Bradley just asked if he could go on a plane again or if the screws would affect him in the metal detector thing. And the consultant seemed to think that was a really weird question, but obviously we were all in total denial, I think, at that point. So the day comes for the operation. They'd originally asked to do the operation the following Wednesday, but that was Zachary's birthday, Bradley's brother's birthday, and Zachary had already lost his last 2 birthdays to COVID and hadn't been able to celebrate them. He'd missed his 18th and his 19th, and this was going to be his 20th birthday. And as there was such a high risk that Bradley might not make the operation, I did not want that to be on his brother's birthday. So we asked to move it. So they agreed to do it the following day, which was Father's Day. It was all a little bit quick, but the next morning Bradley went down for what they said would be an 11-hour operation. He was gone 14 hours, felt like eternity. When they took him into the operating theatre, they asked Simon and I to take one last photo with him and to give him one last kiss just in case. Just feels so wrong to leave them. And then we waited and waited, and he was taken to ICU, which we knew was going to happen. And to be honest, his stay in ICU was relatively normal for a stay in ICU can be. There wasn't really any major drama. He had to have a scan a few times because he got a bit of fluid and that on his brain and had to have that drained. But it was all stuff that they told us to expect. So we were relatively happy with his stay in ICU. And then he was moved back on the ward and he was put back onto the men's ward. And we stayed there for the next couple of weeks, really. But we felt like nobody was particularly doing much for us in the hospital. Simon and I were doing all of the care for Bradley. The nurses were just coming and administering the meds. Simon and I literally had a 4-foot, almost cot mattress on the floor. No bed frame, just a mattress on the floor, no sheets, no pillows, no covers, no nothing that we had to share. And take turns in sleeping in ICU. We slept in wheelchairs because there was nowhere for us to stay. By this point, my legs and my feet were so swollen from 2 weeks in the hospital, and I barely sat down, let alone laid down. I couldn't fit my shoes on anymore because we just had to do so much for Bradley. He couldn't do much still. I remember the first shower. Simon took Bradley in the shower and Simon fell over. They were both giggling and pissing themselves laughing on this wet room floor. They were both absolutely soaked. And it shouldn't have been funny, but it was. Like, that shouldn't be funny. But they were both giggling and laughing. And then every day Bradley was getting a little bit stronger because they'd removed 40% of his tumour and managed to get 3 biopsies. So that for us was massive. And with the tumour being removed, it was alleviating a lot of his symptoms. So gradually every day he was getting more and more movement back, and his face was moving properly, and all of those things that the tumour were affecting had all come back, and it was no longer affecting them. So we asked to go home. We said, there's no point in us being here. Let's go home. So they agreed to let us go home, and the condition that we came back a couple of days later for the results of what the biopsy was going to show. So the following day, we went back, and Bradley asked Zachary to come with him for support. Bradley had had 33 staples in his head, huge, great big staples to hold his head together. So we arrived in the outpatients department. I don't know what I thought. I think I stupidly thought we'd go somewhere, I don't know, a little bit more tactful. But we didn't. We just sat in the normal everyday waiting room with everybody else that was there for their daily issues. And they called Bradley and Zachary into a room, said that they were going to go and take Bradley's staples out, and me and Simon into another room. And we got taken into another little room with 3 chairs and a box of tissues. The consultant sat us down, and she said, there's no easy way to say this, but he has brain cancer. It's called diffuse midline glioma, DNG for short, commonly known as DIPG, which is diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, because his tumour is in his pons. She said it has a mutation that carries a 0% chance of survival. She said there is absolutely nothing we can do. He has months to live, and you now need to leave here and go and make memories, because that's all you've got. And then she said, you'll never see me again. So that's goodbye from us. And then they brought Bradley and Zachary back into the room, like instantly. And Bradley sat down, and she said to Bradley, do you want to know what's wrong? And he said, yeah, I'm just really worried that it's cancer. And she said, well, I'm really sorry, mate, but it's cancer. And he cried, and Zachary cried. I think I fucking wailed across the desk, and she told me to sit up and pull myself together. And then they asked us to leave. It was 14 minutes from leaving the car, checking in the waiting room, getting those results, and getting back to the car. No leaflets, no information, no details. Just, your son has cancer, he's going to die, he has a 0% chance of survival, go home, enjoy yourself. Enjoy myself. Like, how? How do you process that at the same time as your 2 boys sitting in the car? Simon and I couldn't talk because the kids were in the car. Everybody was texting my phone, asking for an update on what the results were. How do you do that? How do you even process that in that time frame, let alone tell anybody else? But we got home. We didn't tell Bradley that she told us that he only had a few months, and we didn't tell Bradley that he had the 0% chance. All he knew was that he had brain cancer and he was going to fight it. So he decided that he wanted to go out with his friends. He wanted to go to the cinema. So we said that was a really good idea. So something as a distraction and something nice for all of us. So we took him to cinema to watch the new Marvel film. His cousins, his friends, his brothers and sisters, me and his dad sat down. It started. And the opening scene was Thor, with the love of his life, dying from stage 4 cancer that was even too strong, that Thor couldn't even beat it and save her, and no love in the world was enough. And it was during that film that Bradley learnt that cancer has stages and grades. Couldn't bloody write it, could you? So then Bradley asked what stage his cancer was, and we told him we didn't know. We lied to him because we needed him to fight. We'd been told that the standard of care for his cancer type was radiotherapy, and it would be 6 weeks, 33 rounds of radiotherapy that was in no way curative. and at best would buy him 12 weeks. 6 weeks of those would be spent in hospital having the treatment. But it hopefully will alleviate the symptoms. If it doesn't, it will make them worse. Yeah. But that we had no choice in that treatment. And in order to have that treatment, they create them a radiotherapy mask, which is a plastic mesh, if you like, that's heated and moulded to the shape of their face. And then every day they are laid on a solid metal bed and screwed to this bed via this mask that sits 3 millimeters away from their face and their shoulders. And the bed is raised 8 feet in the air while they're zapped with radiotherapy that burns their skin and their hair, and they have no choice in that. But he did it every day like a trooper, and every day we would set markers from the car to radiotherapy on how far he could walk without his wheelchair and how far he could walk back. By the end of the 6 weeks, he could walk the whole way there and the whole way back. He was so bloody determined, and he tried so hard, so hard. He was absolutely amazing, phenomenal. But every day he asked us what stage his cancer was. Towards the end of it, the radiotherapy, we told him the truth, that it was stage 4, and that we had been told that there wasn't anything we can do. But we'd done some research online, and there were stories and there were trials and there were hopes, and that we had to have those hopes. And he trusted me. He wholeheartedly trusted me to keep him alive. And so he kept fighting. And I kept researching. And I looked and I searched. I spent every night searching online for a cure to save him. He was working so damn hard. That's the least I could do. But all I came up against was that we needed money, and an obscene amount of money, to even attempt any of these things to keep him alive. And we just didn't have that sort of money. So we had no choice but to go public with everything that was happening to Bradley and hope to raise some money. So we sat down as a family and we discussed it. Everything we did for Bradley, we did with his opinions and what he wanted first and foremost, and then secondly as a family, because I have other kids too. I have 3 other children that also matter, and it was really important that they felt heard in all of this, because I really was aware that he might not make it, and I couldn't have them living a lifetime of regret, and that's a horrible balance to have to do. And as much as it was all about Bradley, and it should have been all about Bradley, it was also about them too. So we had all the discussions as a family, and what was best for us. Very nervously put his story online, and we were met with absolute tremendous support, phenomenal support, overwhelming support that was totally humbling and blew us all away. Bradley rarely cried throughout his whole illness, but he cried a lot over how grateful and humble he was from the support that he had from other people. He just couldn't believe it. He said, I just thought I was just little old me and I didn't matter. And to see that he did matter to all those people was just more than any penny we raised. That was just so important for us. But when we put Bradley's story online, we also created a bucket list for him, because I'd read lots of forums, lots of people with this diagnosis, and so many regrets that people had was that they didn't do all of the things that they should have done. So I knew that that was really important. So we created those memories and we created that bucket list. And again, the world just came together. It was amazing. He did so many amazing things, absolutely amazing things. Selfless and true to Bradley. Every single opportunity that he was offered, every single money can't buy life-changing, once in a lifetime experience that he was offered, he sat and thought about who he could take with him, about who in his circle loved that, who would get the best. You know, he didn't want the joy just to be for him. He wanted it to be for everybody. And he carefully planned all his adventures with people individually. So he took always just one person, 2 people with him, so that they always would have that special memory with him. And they would always share that together because that's who he was. He always thought of other people over himself. And he had an amazing time. And throughout all of that, he was just so determined to get better. And he worked so hard at his physio every day, building his strength. And by the time it sort of came to getting the results from the radiotherapy, you wouldn't even have known he was ill. He was doing so well. So we had the scan, and that revealed that his tumour had shrunk by another 40%. So by now his tumour was hardly detectable, which was just amazing. And he was so happy at the results of his scan. Like that was what he needed. And then we continued doing stuff every day. Every day. Simon took time off work, I took time off work, the kids took time off work, and we just spent the next few months as a family together. And we did stuff every single day. It was exhausting. It was absolutely exhausting. And then it got to the beginning of December and all of the symptoms started to come back. And I just thought we were all a little bit tired. But really, realistically, I was conscious that other things could be happening. I'd analysed Bradley to an inch of his life, that the kid couldn't breathe without me knowing when it wasn't normal. He was starting to show signs of being struggling and not being able to do things. And then these started to get quite intense and it got a little bit scary. So he was due for his next scan at the end of December. But on the 10th of December, we called for that to be early because we wanted to see what was going on. The scan not only showed that his tumour had grown back to pre-radiotherapy size, but he also had really bad COVID, and that impacted him massively. So then he was really ill, and then we decided then that we were going to stop a lot of the stuff that we were doing and just concentrate on family. And we were just going to have family time and just calm everything down on the run up to Christmas, and then just keep him well enough to enjoy Christmas. So that's what we did. During radiotherapy, we'd found the ONC201 trial, the drug that we put Bradley on, and we decided that that's what we were going to put him on. And we'd fundraised enough money to get the first lot of that, and we'd bought that, but his consultant hadn't allowed him to start it, so he hadn't started it at this point. But when we got those results back in December from his scan change, he was now allowed to start the drug because you had to wait for regrowth before you could start the drug. So then we were hopeful that, if we calmed things down and we started this drug, that Bradley would start to improve again. And he did stabilise for a little while. And I think we also just got used to him being ill because it was a bit more of a gradual decline, that I think some of it we missed and normalised maybe a little bit more than we should have done. And then it got to February and Bradley's birthday, his 18th birthday, he wanted a big party with all of his friends, which we did. And looking back now, I don't think that was the right thing that we did. For him and his friends, they all realised quite how poorly Bradley was and how different Bradley was to his friends now, and how much of his life he'd lost in terms of his physicality and his mobility. And his emotions were really starting to be impacted at this point. He was just aware of how different he'd become, and that was impacting him psychologically. So he asked to leave his party early, and me and him just came home and sat in his bed and watched movies. And, we did that a lot, just sat together, and it was nice. He always felt reassured when I was with him. He genuinely thought I'd save him. He trusted me. And then the next day he woke up really ill, and we ended up back in hospital in A&E in Addenbrooke's. That's when shit started to get worse, as if it couldn't. We sat for 6 hours in a cubicle, wasn't seen by a soul, and then his consultant knocked on the cubicle door and asked Simon and I to go and stand in the A&E waiting room of a massive city hospital. And she stood there and said, "I'm withdrawing all care. This is it. He's got days to live. Take him home. He's going to die." And I said to her, "What on earth are you going to do?" And she said, "Nothing." She said, "There's nothing we can do. I've seen this 100 times before." And I said to her, "But you've done nothing. You haven't even so much as touched him." And she said, "I don't need to. I know." And she walked off. That was it. Just clip-clop down the hallway. And we've never seen her since. And I just remember standing there thinking, my boy is so poorly in there. He had lost the ability to go to the toilet. He was so dizzy. So dizzy. He was so ill. His speech was slurred because he was dizzy. And he was in so much pain. And yet they told me just to take him home. By this point, the steroids had made him gain a lot of weight, and he was a big lad. You know, I keep saying it, but he was over 6 foot. There was no way I could lift him out of there. But they just left us. But I'd also learned how to advocate for him and fight for him, so I refused to leave. And said, "No, I'm not going anywhere. Somebody will help him." Well, eventually, by the next morning, they put us on a ward, but they still refused to treat him. Never once did a doctor come and see him. We were there for 3 days because I refused to leave. They just kept asking us to blue light us home because he was going to die any minute. And I just kept saying, he really isn't. He just needs some help. And then the palliative care lady came in and she agreed to put him on anti-sickness drugs and drugs to help with his dizziness. Within an hour, he was better. Within an hour, he could sit up and eat and drink and play Lego. But the doctor still refused to come and treat him. So we sat there for 3 days. The emergency ambulance turned up 3 days later, lights and sirens a lot, to take us home. Nobody noticed the fact that they walked into a room to take a dying boy home who was sitting there watching Sidemen, eating sausage and mash, building a Lego car. I mean, he was not a kid that was dying. But they refused to see it. And at that point, I just thought, I can't fight with these anymore. I'm not going to get the help. And as they went to put him in the ambulance, they fitted him with the end-of-life driver, which has all the medications in it that sedate him and slow everything down so that he dies peacefully. And I could see the change in him. And I knew then that I had to leave because they were actually killing him, not helping him. So we put him in the ambulance and they dropped us off home. And I said to them, "What do we do from here? Who do we ring? Like, what do I do if something happens?" And they said, "Well, you ring his doctor." I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever tried to go getting a doctor's appointment, it's near on impossible. That did not fill me with any confidence at all. And I said, "What do I do outside of 9 to 5? And they said, "Ring 999. And that was it. I've got a kid dying of stage 4 brain cancer and no one. So the next day, a community nurse comes to assess his driver. And Bradley's really ill again. He's covered in a rash and burning, temperatures burning through the roof. And I said to her, "He's really poorly, can you help him?" And she said, "No, it's not in my remit, sorry, love." And I was like, "What do I do?" She said, "You need to call the GP." So I rang the GP with the nurse from the GP surgery standing next to me and told the GP the symptoms of Bradley, to which she responded, "Sounds like he's got sepsis." And I said, "What do I do about that?" And she said, "You have 2 choices. You can take him into hospital and he can die there, or you can leave him at home and he can die of the sepsis rather than the cancer. That seems like a kinder option to me, don't you think?" These shouldn't be conversations that are had. And then she said, "But it's up to you. I'll leave you to decide." And she hung up. So I called an ambulance because what else can I do, right? And after a lot of toing and froing with the ambulance, because they'd obviously been told that he was stage 4 dying and untreatable, I managed to argue with them and get them to agree to take us to A&E. And then it turns out it was the driver that was causing the rash and the temperature. It took 20 minutes for the doctor in at A&E to make the adjustments, and he was fine, and eating and drinking, and the rash all went. They had just been inserted incorrectly. So then we go home, and Macmillan come to introduce themselves, and I asked them to remove the driver, and they did. They agreed. They removed it. They said they'd come back the next day and fit it again, but I think they were just humouring me. But I told them that I didn't believe that Bradley was dying, and I felt that I wanted him to be more compos mentis. I didn't want him knocked out on drugs. To take the driver away, allow him to be present. So they removed the driver, and he stayed for 3 months without that driver. I just wish that the professionals could have seen him. But anyway, we paid for him to have a private MRI scan, and it showed that he had no tumour growth. All these side effects were not due to the tumour. His tumour was stable, but the doctors still refused to help us. So we did the next few months on our own. And for a couple of weeks, Bradley got slightly better, and we had a nice time. And he had lots of times with his friends, and he really enjoyed being with his friends, and we had lots of lovely family times. Again, as wrong as it sounds, there were some real fun moments, and we enjoyed all that time. And we were all still really hopeful that we would keep him alive long enough for some treatment to be found that would work. Then he started to get worse, and that was all happening really, really quickly. And by the end of April, he was getting really bad, and it was really affecting his mental health, and his anxiety went off the scale. And I would say his anxiety levels were harder to deal with than his physical symptoms. He was so scared. He knew that he was going to die, but the whole time he'd thought that we'd do something to stop it, that it wouldn't happen to him, and he now could feel all of these changes. They call this cancer type, it's a bit like having locked-in syndrome, in that the kids lose everything, from their hearing to their eyesight, their ability to move, to sit up, to hold their head up, their ability to use the toilet, to control their own temperature, to control their own breathing, to be able to swallow. But they don't lose their mind. So all of this happens while their mind stays completely intact. So cruel. Bradley got very stressed, and due to the medication and the steroids and that he was on, he'd now gained a lot of weight. And with being paralysed, he was like a dead weight, and it was almost impossible to lift him. You know, his dad's only 5'10", so it was just so hard. And we were really struggling. We were on our own. We had nobody. We saw nobody. We hadn't seen a professional person in about 11 weeks. And it was just becoming impossible, and we didn't know what to do. So again, I started contacting anybody and everybody who would listen to help us. And eventually the Teenage Cancer Trust support at Addenbrooke's said that they would try and help us find a hospice to get some care to support Bradley. And they texted me and told me that they'd got him a place in a hospice and that we were just waiting for availability. But then Bradley very quickly got worse. So I called the hospice myself and said, you know, can you come out and do an assessment? Can you help us? What do we do next? We don't really have any support, so I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And they said they'd never heard of him. And they said that they couldn't take him. It was just another one of those moments of, how many times does my boy have to keep being let down? Like, I'm trying so hard not to fail him, but we as a family are being failed at every turn, and it was so hard. So hard. And so, because he was also an adult, I was unable to do a lot of the advocating for him because he had to speak for himself. So I tried ringing around and getting support from people, and it was just becoming impossible. So I turned to social media again, and I put a plea out on social media and just said, you have no idea how tough things are and how much Bradley is really struggling and suffering, but nobody will help us. And the amazing people that all stepped up for Bradley when he first fell ill all stepped up again, and over 200 people wrote to our local MP and complained. And together with them and Darien House, the hospice that were helping Emily, the staff there, and a follower of Bradley's whose wife worked at the local adults hospital, we managed to convince them to come out and do a crisis intervention assessment on Bradley. I actually think the assessment was more on me because I think they thought I was a crazy lunatic. But they came out and assessed us all as a family and agreed to admit Bradley the next day, which we were so grateful for, because we couldn't get Bradley into a children's hospice because he was 18. And an adults hospice normally only really take patients over 25. So Bradley sat in this area of nobody wanted to help him. He just didn't fit anybody's criteria. So again, we were just stuck. But Sue Ryder, Thorpe Hall at Peterborough, agreed to take Bradley, and they were amazing. Absolutely just angels. Like, they gave Simon and I space to stay because they knew how anxious Bradley was. So they agreed that we could stay. They set us up both beds. We had proper beds next to Bradley's that we could both stay with him. And they looked after Bradley, and they looked after us, and they looked after us all as a family. Bradley spent 4 weeks in Sue Ryder, and they cared for him so much. They couldn't do enough for him. They were amazing. And thankfully he got some peace. They allowed us, we had 20 odd visitors a day, dogs, cats, horses, you name it. God, Bradley's room, it was our party room. Just Eats come in every day. Yeah, it was ridiculous. But we had fun and we made it enjoyable for Bradley. And Thorpe Hall enabled us to do that. And there was even talk that once we could curb Bradley's anxiety, because that was our main issue, was that every day Bradley would push the button and call for the doctor, and the doctor would come. And they'd say, "What's up, mate?" And he'd say, "Is today the day I'm going to die?" And they'd say, "No, not today, mate. When you can no longer ask me that question, that'll be the day." But he probably rang that buzzer 6 times a day for that reassurance of, am I going to die? Over those weeks that he was in there, he lost the ability to hold his head up, to sit up. He'd already lost the ability to stand and to move. He'd already lost his eyesight in one eye, and he was gradually losing it in the other eye. He really struggled to be able to know when he needed to go to the toilet. He really struggled to control his temperature. And I think one of the worst things for me was he was no longer able to cry. So it was really hard to know when he was sad, because he just genuinely had no tears left. So how many times did my boy sit there crying and think that we were all ignoring him because it wasn't visible? It robbed him of everything, but not his mind. It was so cruel. And then he got pneumonia. And they said that if the medication didn't work within 48 hours, then it wasn't going to work. And it didn't work. And Bradley died 6 days later. They told us to expect what was going to happen when he died, and that didn't happen. It was nothing like what they said. Genuinely didn't know it was coming. I mean, obviously we knew he was going to die, but not in that moment. Those amazing people that all supported him online, They all came to his funeral. Hundreds and hundreds of people came. People we've never met, because that's who Bradley was. That's who Bradley is. He just has that effect on people. You know, he smiled still the whole way through this. It was still fun. He put other people before himself all the time, and he tried so damn hard. And he never ever gave up. And he's just amazing. And it's all just so cruel. And I just wish that we could have been in a position where we could have given him a lot more help that he deserved. And I just wish that I never even knew what TMG was. But now here we are. And now we just try and remember him every day. That's all we can do.
Are you exhausted?
Yeah.
I am too.
Oh, it's so hard. And it's so hard to do it and not focus on all the bad. But he was so let down.
He was let down. He was so let down. I mean,
he just deserved so much more.
it's bad enough going through what you're going through, but when you've got to fight every single day to get the basic help, you just didn't get it.
You shouldn't be left with a child that's been told they're going to die with no care because they've seen it 100 times before and he's going to die anyway.
Yeah.
So, you know, we haven't really got the time for him. He's just one off our books.
It's absolutely disgusting.
And as a parent, you just feel like you've let him down so much.
I know.
So much.
There's nothing I can say to that because that's our job. We're parents. That's our job. And no matter how much we fight, that fight was taken out of our hands. We could have never, ever have saved them. We just couldn't. We just had to make the journey that there was going on. Just get them through each day as best as we possibly could.
Yeah. And Bradley was a fighter, and you know what? He did make every day enjoyable, and he did make every day fun, and there was never a day he didn't have a smile on his face, you know? Like, I'd have been such a moaning bitch. I think if the tables were turned, I'd have been feel so sorry for myself, and never once did Bradley feel sorry for himself.
No, Em didn't. Em didn't. They actually made it easier for us, didn't they? They made it easier for us to cope.
Yeah, and the way that they're so selfless and just think of other people all the time. You know, I'm sure there was lots that Bradley went through that he never told me.
Yeah. Just to save you,
and
to
that
save
feels
his
difficult.
mum. Yeah.
Yeah, and they shouldn't have to do that, should they?
No, but they did. What are you going to do today now to recover from this?
I don't know. Eat. I'm such an emotional eater. For God's sake, like, honestly, I'm an octopus. Is it an octopus? They eat their emotions, don't they?
I don't know.
Yeah. Gonna have to Google that now.
Well, I can't eat because it's Fat Club in the morning at 9:30, so could have done this on a different day. Thanks for that. And I don't drink.
Oh, there you go. Well, I helped you.
Yeah. I think I'll take up drinking. Let's have a calm day today then. Let's just get through it. Reflect.
It's so hard to do that without breaking down, and I wish that I could tell that story and focus so much more on Bradley, but right now I'm just not able to.
The story is the story.
To get over.
If you missed out those bits, it wouldn't be the story. You're just telling your story. You're telling Brad's story, and that is what you've done. And as hard, as difficult as it is to tell the story, it's difficult to hear as well because it's unfair. Everything's unfair from the second he was poorly. Everything is unfair on so many different levels.
Yeah.
So we'll sign off for today. We won't do the usual sign off. We'll just say thank you for listening. Hope now you know both Emily's and Brad's stories now that you know where we're coming from. and our laughing and joking on some podcasts get us through those days where underneath we're just absolutely heartbroken.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Bye.